Well, hello everyone. It's John Lockland here. I'm the director of FVD International, Forum for Democracy International. Welcome to this week's forum. I'm delighted to say that we've got with us one of our co-hosts, Peter Lavelle, and our other co-host, Jeremy Nell, will be joining us shortly. I'm speaking to you this week from Paris, which, as far as I know, is the capital of the most over-medicalized country in the entire world. And I'm therefore delighted to introduce our guest this week, Dr. Stuart Fischbein, who's going to talk to us about the over-medicalization of childbirth and, who knows, maybe also other aspects of human life. Stuart, thank you very much for being with us. Where are you joining us from? And tell us about yourself and how you came to be interested in this.
Thank you, John. I'm in southern Utah in a very small town. I sort of left Los Angeles a couple of years ago after 40 years there. How I came to be here is, well, first of all, I think it's an honor for me to be able to speak to an audience that I don't normally reach. So I want to thank you and your team for having me on.
Yeah, we've issues on medical matters. One of the big subjects that the party leader Thierry Baudet took up was the COVID business during in 2020, 2021. And it's a kind of spin-off from that. We've had quite a few people talking about vaccines, talking about, of course, COVID itself and the World Health Organization. So, medicine is something that we've covered on several occasions.
Yeah, and childbirth is something that affects obviously every family in the world. We were all born, and hopefully we'll all, have the lovely experience of having children. And it's been, as you said, very over-medicalized. But that's not my history. My history was such that I was traditionally trained in medical school. I went to the medical school at University of Minnesota, which is my home state. And then I ended up matching my residency program in Southern California at a very nice hospital here called Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. And I was very lucky at the time because Cedars-Sinai had an affiliate with LA County USC Women's Hospital, which at that time was the busiest delivering hospital in the United States, doing about 22,000 births a year, which is about 65 babies a day. And I was there for 4 months and every other day. So that's 60 days, 65 babies a day. You guys can do the math. And you can see that we saw a lot of everything. And breech delivery, twin delivery, forceps delivery was just considered a variation of normal. And so it was an era of training, which doesn't really exist anymore. But I came out of my residency in an era when medicine was completely different than it is now.
So what are you talking about, Stuart, just so that everyone understands? What is this, 20, 30 years ago?
Oh, I'm talking, I started my residency in 1982. I finished it in 1986. So we're talking almost 40 years ago.
Yeah, but you're teasing us here. What changed?
Okay.
He's coming on.
Yeah. Well, if I don't want to jump around because if I don't lay some foundation, people won't understand. So when you came out of residency back in the mid 80s, you did not do what doctors do now, which is generally get a job working for an organization or a government or whatever else, working a shift, getting paid a salary. You developed your own practice. You were an independent physician. You didn't have any master. You were your own boss. You had privileges at hospitals. You brought your patients there. But you had to build your own practice from scratch. And so one of the things that happened to me as I was trying to build a practice was I was approached by some of the local home birth midwives in Southern California and asked if I would take their home birth transports. And this was the beginning of a transformation for me because I had no knowledge about home birth and I had very little knowledge about midwifery. They don't teach us that stuff in residency program. We learn very medicalized ways of dealing with things. And over that period of time, I began to learn from the midwives that pretty much everything I knew about medicine and obstetrics only applied to about 10 or 15% of the women who are pregnant, and about 85% of women didn't need pretty much anything I had to offer. And yet obstetricians are still the ones taking care in my country of about 93% of women when they're not really the experts in normal birthing. Obstetricians are experts in high-risk problems and surgery. That's even what the specialty, what it means. So I, again, practiced a very medicalized form of birth. I was the guy dressed in the full hazmat suit, guys, at the end of the bed with a woman in lithotomy position with her legs up in stirrups, covering her legs with grapes and washing off her bottom with betadine and catching her baby and rushing to clamp the umbilical cord immediately and then showing her this beautiful thing that she just created. And instead of handing it to her, I would turn around and I'd walk across the room and set it down in the warmer on the other end of the room. And I did this for a decade or more before I began to realize that this isn't right. But yet this is what's done. And I did breech deliveries and twin deliveries. And eventually I decided that I wanted to try a different tack. And so I started a collaborative practice with 2 midwives in a hospital just north of Los Angeles. Cedars-Sinai at that time did not allow midwives to continue to have privileges. So I wanted to try an in-hospital based collaborative practice where the midwives took care of the normal stuff and I took care of the what I found interesting, which was the abnormal stuff. And it worked really well for about 15 years, but we were never accepted in the community. And this is a problem that all innovative people feel in whatever field they're in.
Was that because of financial reasons, procedural reasons, professional, institutional reasons?
Some of it was financial, because we were doing things that didn't make the hospitals as much money. Like our clients didn't want epidurals. They wanted to go home right away afterwards. They didn't want hepatitis vaccine or vitamin K necessarily. So that's one thing. Another was fear. And fear is obviously the most motivating emotion you can have. And it made the other doctors nervous. It made the anesthesiologists nervous. It made the pediatricians nervous. It made the nurses nervous because we were doing something different. And you always fear what you don't understand. And these people didn't understand that birthing can be done beautifully without all the medical interventions.
Presumably, midwifing is something that came way before it was medical. I mean, I know very little about it, but common sense
the history.
This must have a much longer history than the professionalization of it.
Peter, the history of what happened in medicine is fascinating. If people wanted to take a time to look into that, but I'll just summarize by saying, yes, midwives essentially delivered babies forever. Yeah. And only in the last few hundred years, and specifically in our country, in the United States, in the last 100 years, where the Rockefellers and something called the Flexner Report came out, and it vilified and mocked midwifery, it mocked alternative medicine, and they took control of the medical schools, they took control of medicine, and they wrenched it away from people that had been practicing it for eons, and they medicalized everything, and then they ostracized people who were thinking differently than they did. So they took over the medicine, and and unfortunately, the outcomes are not better, and that's something hopefully we'll get into today.
But that's obviously an element of misogyny, wouldn't you say? I mean, taking it away from women.
Yeah, you could say that. Yeah, I mean, did they do it because they were misogynists, or did they do it because they thought it was a good idea, or did they do it because they thought that they could make a lot of money by taking control of it? And ultimately, that's where it all boils down to. I mean, getting rid of natural substances, herbs, homeopathy, because you can't patent that stuff. You can't control that stuff. And so making that, vilifying that to the public, making it seem like it's, a witch's brew and what I lovingly call cauldron stuff, they were very effective at that. They had an ad campaign that made midwives look like wenches, and they said, would you rather go to this person, or would you rather come to this nice, clean, linoleum-lined aluminum room with, where you can get your hair done and you can get a nice meal and you can have your baby without any pain? And I mean, they did an advertising number on Western world, and we bought it.
You said, Stuart, a moment ago that you practiced for, I believe you said 10 or 15 years with the midwives, and you weren't accepted by the community. What community are you referring to? The medical community or the community at large?
The community in my hospital, that community. So
medical colleagues, you mean, your medical colleagues
at that hospital. Yeah, it's John, that's a really good question. People talk about standard of care and they talk about your medical community. The truth is that obstetricians are not the medical community of midwives. Yet community is often defined by your zip code, which is which is a real mistake to do that. So the community that I was in, we had really good outcomes. We had a 7% C-section rate at a time when the national average was in the high 20s. And the other doctors at the hospital had high 20% C-section rates, and we were at 7. We took all comers. The midwives took care of the normal stuff, and I took care of the things that needed doctor's attention, like a C-section or like a breech delivery or vacuum or forceps delivery or an ectopic pregnancy or cervical cancer. Those were the things that I took care of. But the pap smears, the routine health care, the birth control, the prenatal visits, the catching of normal babies, the postpartum visit, the breastfeeding assistance, that was done by midwives, because doctors actually don't have any training in that. The system is really, really broken if you think about it. In the hospital model, among all the things that they do, and we could talk from the very beginning, from the moment you have your first prenatal visit or the moment you get in your car to drive to the hospital until the moment you put the baby into the car seat to drive home, everything that's done to you is really antithetical to nature's design. But even after you deliver your baby and you go home on day 2, the doctor says, well, we'll see you in 6 weeks. Whereas the midwifery model, the midwife will comes to your house on day 2 and day 4 and maybe day 7 and maybe 2 weeks. And they're constantly available. And the person that you call at night, if you have a question, is the person you know, as opposed to the medical model now, which is very much different than it was in 1986, where everybody works on a shift. And so there's large groups. You call at night or you come into labor and you may get a perfect stranger. And mammals don't labor well when they're nervous, when they're anxious. You would never do to your favorite pet what we do to the human female in labor. You would not take away their food and water. You would not interrupt them constantly. You would not immobilize them. You would not numb them. You would not hyperstimulate them. You would not cut the cords immediately. You would not take the babies away from them. You wouldn't do any of those things. And yet those are routine in hospitals in the Western world.
Stuart, you see behind you what seems to be the badge or something of it's in German, Hebamme, which is the German for midwife. It seems to be Austrian perhaps, or Southern German. Just before we came online, you said you'd spent your career unlearning everything you learnt in medical school, just as Peter and I have spent our own careers unlearning everything we learnt at university. How do midwives train? How do they learn?
Well, exactly, and it's such a. I remember it growing up. I can remember the cheap TV series of, oh, don't go to a midwife. Oh my goodness, I mean, it was very stigmatized. I remember it very, very clearly. And number one, what was the process of doing it? And it presumably still exists. I mean, but how can you find out about it if it is so marginalized?
Oh, the midwives are still everywhere, but they are marginalized and they are regulated and by a profession that shouldn't be regulating them. Midwives should not be regulated by obstetricians. As I said earlier, it's a completely separate profession. You asked how they're trained. Well, the term midwife is an interesting term because it's been sort of abducted because it doesn't mean what it used to mean. I lovingly say that the term midwife is like the term ice cream. Okay. If you say you want ice cream, I'm going to ask you, well, what do you want? Chocolate? Do you want Rocky Road? Do you want Jerry's Garcia? I mean, what kind of ice cream do you want? And midwife is the same thing. You could the term midwife could include anyone who is a unlicensed traditional midwife on indigenous people's lands to a certified nurse midwife working in a hospital system where she is basically just a medicalized person who does everything that an obstetrician does, and yet they carry the title midwife. What I'm talking about with midwives is generally the traditionally trained midwife. They're often trained, they either will go to school or they will do it online, and they will have an apprenticeship model where they're spending a lot of time with an experienced midwife in the field, as opposed to a certified nurse midwife program where they have to be an RN or a nurse first, and they go through academia, and they come out extremely medicalized and extremely indoctrinated into the fear-based model, which has caused so many problems. And hopefully we'll get into that today too.
Yeah, you mentioned the shifts, the people, working increasingly in shifts, so you don't know who you're going to get on the day. That sounds like an economic factor. And then you hinted earlier, Stuart, at the other economic factors. Let's go into that. I mean, I think we all know where we're heading on this, but perhaps you could give us some details.
Well, in the medical world, whether you have private health insurance or you have a government-run system, the system pays for the more that you do. So I'll just give a basic example. For cesarean section, hospital systems make more money if a woman has a cesarean section than if they have a vaginal delivery. Doctors don't make as much more. Don't get paid significantly more for that, but they do save time. But hospitals make a lot of money. So what's the incentive for somebody running a hospital system to lower their C-section rate? There isn't one. It's a perverse incentive. It's the opposite incentive. So money influences everything. If you take a woman who goes to an obstetrician for a first prenatal visit, they probably are going to do an ultrasound. They're probably going to draw blood. Then they're going to tell you that you need another ultrasound at 20 weeks. Then they're going to find something on that ultrasound that tells you need another ultrasound to follow up in 4 to 6 weeks. Then they're going to tell you you're over 35, so your placenta could give out, so we need to start testing your baby. Then they're going to tell you need to have certain vaccines in pregnancy, which of course have never been tested for safety, and you guys have probably beat that horse to death. Hopefully you did. Then they're going to tell you need to have diabetes screening and cultures for something called Group B strep. Every one of these things along the way they can bill for and they can charge for. And so, but not all of them, and most of them are not necessary in most women. Yet the medical model thinks that they are now. It's become indoctrinated into the system as if you come in without those tests done, then you're an oddball and you're somebody to be scrutinized. Go ahead, sorry.
Well, that's my question. I mean, can you opt out, or is there such professional peer pressure that, I mean, what if a woman says, well, no, I clearly don't need this treatment now. I mean, you haven't found anything to warrant it. I mean, do women do that, or is it when you were describing it, I was thinking AI has already taken over the medical field, okay? Because everybody is so robotic and routinized, it doesn't seem to be much thinking involved.
No, and when you're an employee of a system that does things a certain way, then that also eliminates your ability to independently think. And that's another thing why doctors being employees is one of the worst things that I think happened to medicine, along with many other worse things that happened in medicine. So the question you asked was about, can a woman opt out? And yes, they can, but most don't, because there's this thing called authoritative knowledge, or this hierarchical thing. He's got the white coat and he's got the degrees and all the letters behind his name, so he must know better. But you guys, I'm sure you've heard the William Buckley quote about he'd rather be governed by the first 500 people names in the Boston phone book than the entire faculty of Harvard University. And that's a theme probably for you guys, about academia does not make you wise. It may make you book smart, but it doesn't make you wise. So women can opt out, but then they're labeled as non-compliant. And if they choose to do things that are against what the hospital wants, they're often either subtly or overtly coerced by the hospital by telling them, things that, well, if you do that, you might die, or if you don't do this, we might have to call Child Protective Services on you. And my inbox, by the way, guys, I mean, you'd have a field day just reading my inbox every day from people who tell me what we lovingly on our podcast call the dumb doctor dogma. And that's just a nice way of putting the tyranny that doctors will enforce on people, the coercion that they use, the overt nature of saying things in such a dogmatic way, as if there's only one way of doing something. And here's the rub, guys. If outcomes had gotten so much better over the last 50 years, you could probably say, okay, all right, so there's a reason for all these interventions because we're getting really good outcomes now. But the truth is the outcomes have gotten worse. C-section rates have gone up 500, 600, 7. In Jeremy's country, he told me it's closing in on 80% C-section rate, when 50 years ago it was 5%. And the rate of cerebral palsy, the rate of neonatal death is not lower. And the rate of neonatal morbidity and the rate of maternal mortality is higher. And yet it's the definition of insanity, as we all know, because they want to just do more of it, as opposed to saying, you know what, we're wrong. We should bow out. We should let someone else take over because we've really screwed up. But they won't say that because they can't. They have too much cognitive dissonance to say things like that.
I think cognitive dissonance is surely the right. You've got it dead right there. You mentioned ultrasounds, Stuart. Now, I'm very more than open to the general idea of over-medicalization, big pharma, and so on. But surely ultrasounds are an extremely unintrusive and ultimately, well, yes, it's a medical practice. But surely, are they? Surely they're not damaging, or are they? Perhaps you think they are. And are they not an example of a good development? And I asked that question also in the context of what you said about finance. You said that hospitals have an interest in performing C-sections. I live in France, and I'm British. In Britain, the financial argument really can't work because everything is paid for by the state and the budget of the health service balloons all the time. So the pressure is in the other direction. The individual hospitals don't have any incentive at all to perform, as far as I understand anyway. On the contrary, they're always trying to save money. And in France, it's a little different because there's no link between the clinic where you go for your ultrasound and the person prescribing the ultrasound. Are ultrasounds also part of the problem, or are they a good thing that is maybe just not necessary?
Okay, I've got a lot of thoughts on what you just said. So let me start with the first one, which was the hospitals, even in a government-run system. They may be trying to cut costs, but hospitals get paid by the government for what they do. Mm-hmm. So unless they're capitated, which I think capitation reared its ugly head in the late 80s, early 90s, and then it disappeared because it was found to be completely unethical. If you paid somebody a bunch of money and then they had to cover people, then they cut corners. So they got rid of that. But even in a government system, the more the hospital does, the more they bill the government, the more the government has to send them money to cover what they've done. So there's that motive. All right. Now, as far as ultrasound goes, yeah, there's been some great innovations in medicine. And these things have, they initially start out as a very good idea with a very narrow window of indication. But what happens is that it starts to expand. And ultrasound's a perfect example. When ultrasound first came out, private doctors did not have them in their office. And somehow babies were born. Mm. Mm. Then it became affordable, and they found that they could bill for these things. So every doctor bought an ultrasound machine. And when you buy an ultrasound machine, you tend to use the ultrasound machine because it's sitting there next to the exam table, and you might as well just turn it on. And not only when you turn it on, but then there's a code that you can use to bill for that. So why not do that? So then you asked about two things about ultrasound itself. So again, it started out as great technology. There's a lot of things that do that. But with ultrasound, two things. First of all, it is a form of non-ionizing radiation. And no one really has studied it since the late 1980s in China, were the last studies on human subjects regarding the effects of this non-ionizing radiation. And we know that when you turn on the color Doppler, or when you turn on hi Jeremy, when you turn on the color Doppler, or when you turn on the 3D ultrasound to take a cute little picture of your baby's face, that is a higher intensity of non-ionizing radiation, and that there has to be some effect on that. We just don't know what it is. But the biggest downside of ultrasound, John, is that they find things that don't necessarily mean anything, but they plant seeds of doubt and fear. And they have what's called the false positives. And so then more testing becomes in place. And then eventually people are getting so nervous that they suggest induction of labor. And then the induction leads to that cascade of interventions. And then that baby is born either through artificial means or by cesarean section. And then that baby's whole microbiome and epigenetics and all that stuff is altered. And no one's bothering to take a look at what we're doing to the generations of children that have just come in the last 50 years, plus that are coming in the future. Other than we can look at the results and say that these children are the sickest generation of children we've ever seen.
Yeah.
Some of that obviously is related to 5G. Some of that's related to vaccines. Some of that's related to heavy metals and toxins and food in our environment and who knows what else. But certainly it parallels the rise in interventions and C-sections, and maybe it parallels the altered microbiome and the use of antibiotics and things like that. Like antibiotics too was started out as a great invention. But now, you know, every woman in labor, if she's got anything, if she's labors too long, they put them on antibiotics when there really isn't that strong an indication in most cases, with no concern about what that antibiotic is doing to that baby's environment, that mother's microbiome. They don't have any concern about that because their only concern, as I lovingly say on my podcast all the time, is a live baby in the bassinet. And how the baby gets in the bassinet is not really their concern. And what happens to that baby, that mother, and that mother's future babies is not the system's concern. The system is only concerned with having a baby that's live now. How that baby does a year from now, how that baby bonds and how it latches and how it breastfeeds and how whether it has chronic illnesses or not is not its concern. They don't even know. They have no idea.
RFK Jr. during the campaign said that there was no greater source of profit for the big pharma than a sick child, because this is someone who requires medicine for the whole of their life. Stuart, you've just said something incredible. Well, no, it's not incredible. I believe it. But can you flesh it out? You say this is this generation of children is the sickest ever. Starting when? Let's have some more information on that, because that's terrible what you've just said. I'm sure it's true, but it's horrendous.
Well, I get my information actually. I've read so many books on this, and as you guys probably have as well. My first foray into it was reading "Dissolving Illusions" by Suzanne Humphreys, but then I read into a bunch of books by a guy named Forrest McReady called "Moth and the Iron Lung," the autism vaccine, and Crooked, Man-Made Disease Explained. Then, of course, Robert Kennedy Jr. and Brian Hooker came out with Vax, Unvaxxed, which is the book that everybody should have come out with years ago, where they looked at outcomes in about, 19 different areas of health, from eczema to ADHD to autism to Crohn's disease. And they found that in every single category, these babies were healthier if they had been unvaccinated than babies that were partially or fully vaccinated. So I don't know how you can dispute that kind of evidence. But more importantly, it starts at the very beginning. Nature has a design for how babies are supposed to come out. And babies are supposed to pick their birthday. Now, obviously, nature isn't perfect, but it's a perfect design. Sometimes perfect designs, like a beautiful car or like a Tesla, will malfunction. But nature, for the most part, doesn't malfunction. It designs something. And so there's a reason labor should start when it starts. There's a reason that babies need to go through the reflexes and the challenges of coming through vaginally. There's a reason they need to be colonized with the bacteria that colonize their nasopharynx, their respiratory tract, and their gut with the proper early bacteria that sets them up, because 80% of our immune system, this is what people like Zach Bush have told me, is that comes from your gut flora. And if you're colonized with the wrong bacteria, say you're born by a sterile pre-labor cesarean section where the baby hasn't been challenged, it hasn't been in communication with its mother, it hasn't gone through the stresses and reflexes and twisting and things of labor, and it's come out and is exposed to bacteria that are in the hospital, that baby is more likely to have things like childhood asthma, adult onset diabetes, other autoimmune disorders. We know that. The studies are nobody disputes those studies anymore. So Why is that? Well, and maybe that sets people up down the road, children, for all these other things that are happening. And then we inject them with heavy metals and we give them food. In my country, at least in some of your countries, the food is healthier. I mean, this whole thing lately going on, we had a big hearing in Washington recently where, can't remember her real name, but she goes by the Food Babes, talked about the difference between this kind of Fruit Loops and that kind of Fruit Loops. And when I was in England, I read the label on ketchup, which you guys, I think, call tomato sauce in England, or that's what they call it in Australia. But you basically have tomatoes, salt, and vinegar. In American ketchup, you got hydrogenated corn syrup, you got red dye number 72. I'm making this stuff up, but you got all this kind of other stuff in there to make it taste better, but it's less healthy. Why do they do that? Why do they put that stuff in there when they know it's not healthy in my country? And again, maybe it gets back to your point that if somebody's sick.
It tastes better. That's what it is. It tastes better. And it's an addiction. I've lived in Moscow, Russia for 25 years. Stuart, there's virtually no child obesity here. It's virtually unheard of. It just doesn't happen. And young people, even though they're kind of westernized a lot of their diet, they don't have any the food is under very high control. You can't have this artificial what is the term I'm looking for? HMO?
Additives, ingredients.
They're forbidden. You can't have them. Okay, you can't sell it on the market. Okay, and I would just say that by exercise and things like that, probably on par with the West, but what they eat is very different. Okay.
And I would willing to bet that, well, they do. I don't know about alcohol there, but I would willing to bet that diabetes
is down and going down every single year. Okay.
And I would bet they have far less diabetes and far less things than we have in America. We have an epidemic of these things. And as you said earlier, John, it's an annuity for a pharmaceutical company to have somebody who, when they're 6 years old, has to get on a medication and they're on it for the rest of their life. And then they have to take medications for the side effect of those medications.
Stuart,
and my country is one of the only two countries in the world, I think, along with New Zealand, that allows direct to consumer advertising. And so you're watching a sporting event or you're watching CNN or some other news channel, and every commercial is for a drug that you can't even pronounce the name, but the pattern of the commercial is the same. It shows this like person or couple doing stuff, and suddenly they've got a pain, and then they talk about this new drug, and then they have 20 seconds of the worst side effects you can ever imagine, and then they show them then they show them walking hand in hand with their grandchildren again. If they take this, ask your doctor about this drug who you can't pronounce. And my conclusion about that is nobody's going to go to their doctor and ask them of a drug they can't pronounce. It's a way to money launder. It's a way for drug companies to get money into newsrooms and to journals and other things so that they can control what the news and the journals will publish. Because if they publish or have a news story about something that's anti-pharmaceutical, pharmaceutical companies can just say, hey, we're going to pull our advertising. And so they've captured, just like they've captured the regulatory agencies, they've captured the media as well. So there's no, as you said, we were talking earlier about the reliable places are podcasts and Substack as to where you get your news. You can't get your news from commercial news anymore.
Let's hear about that, Stuart. How have they captured the regulatory agencies?
Well, in my country, they're a revolving door. Essentially, the pharmaceutical industry funds the FDA.
Yep.
And people like Bill Gates, they fund the World Health Organization.
Yep.
So if they get their funding from people and those people want them to have a certain agenda, they're not going to say no. They're cowards.
I know that Bill Gates funds the WHO, but does he have interests in big pharma as well?
Well, that would be over my head, but I can't imagine he doesn't, because he's pushing vaccines all the time. So there's got to be something in it for him.
Right. Absolutely, right. He does. Yes.
Yeah, there were there was the whole Africa thing where they were trying to sterilize African women with a tetanus shot that had unnecessarily had fractions of the HCG, the pregnancy molecule, in the vaccine. No one, I mean, the only person that got punished for that was the guy, the whistleblower, who died suddenly of COVID. Funny how that happens. But nobody who put that stuff in there got punished. Nobody went to jail that I know of. Anyway, I'm getting outside my expertise.
Gents, I apologize for my late arrival. I had a delayed flight, and that's why I'm talking to you from a farm up country on my mobile device. But Stuart, you and I have chatted offline a few times, and I just want to say Peter and John aren't aware that you had a very big role in my wife's birth. A huge role, significant role. We listened to your podcast quite a bit, and we found a lot of information that, funnily enough, is suppressed. And that's what you were talking about earlier. You know, there's a problem with informed consent. Now, I don't know if Peter and John know, but South Africa has one of the highest rates of C-section in the world, around 80% in private healthcare. In other words, 8 out of 10 women will get a C-section. And when my wife went in, a few months earlier, she was given the choice, right? The choice to have an elective C-section. Now, that should be an emergency, Stuart. And that just kind of shows you how it's derailed.
Are you saying that it's not that she's given the choice of an elective C-section that's wrong. That's part of giving information. It's probably the way it's presented to her.
Yes.
That it's presented in like this beautiful,
if you do homework,
loving.
It's very dangerous.
It's what?
Don't do that. Rather go for C-section. It's the safest.
Yeah, that's a lie. That's an absolute lie. That is being propagated by people who probably are brainwashed to believe it, or they're incentivized to believe it. Because again, I think it's nefarious. There's no way that any human being who's not indoctrinated and brainwashed can actually think that 8 out of 10 women cannot have their baby as nature designed in 2 generations. 50 years ago, the C-section rate in South Africa was single digits. What's happened to women in 50 years that their pelvises suddenly got smaller and babies change shape and their uteruses don't work anymore? No, that's not possible. That's not how nature works. So this is all iatrogenic. This has all been caused by a system that benefits from it, either like expediency or money, as we've talked about, or medical legally, but it's not about the individual woman and what's best for that woman and that baby. And certainly when they do a section on that woman, they've now increased the risk to all her future babies, because now she has a scarred uterus and she's at risk for the uterine scar separating, which is unfortunately called rupture, because rupture is just such a bad word, but the scar can separate, which can cause problems, and for something called abnormally invasive placenta, which is placenta where the placenta starts to invade the uterine wall. In 1960, the rate of placenta accreta was about 1 in 30,000. Now it's about 1 in 272 pregnancies. That's insane.
And what was very interesting is when we were chatting to the OBGYN, leading up to birth, about 60% of the conversation was about him being sued for getting it wrong. And so this is why hospitals and the entire medical industry go for that. They just don't want to be sued. There's too much money to lose.
Yeah. I can't, that's not something, again, that's a system problem that, it's, I wouldn't hold my breath that your legislatures and your parliament are going to fix that sort of thing, because who's lobbying them? Who's got a stronger lobby, the individual patient, the midwife, or the trial lawyers? So you're not going to see a change, and that's why women need to leave the system. and the system cannot be fixed. It's, you know, there's another vaccine book, which is an excellent one, called Turtles All the Way Down. And it's, you guys maybe have heard of it. And it's funny because the title talks about the fact that the world sits on the back of a turtle. It's an old, I think it's an old Indian or some cultural story about the instability of the thing. And if you build something on a foundation that's shaky, then it's always going to be shaky. And the foundation of the medicalized birth system in the world is not fixable. So women are going to have to figure out a way to reclaim their autonomy, and, you know, and be sure that they're given the choices that they deserve, so that their babies can have the start in the world that they deserve and have a healthier future.
Well, I mean, Stuart, but where are all the feminists on this? I mean, they're you know, abortion is, you know, that we hear about nonstop, an American to an American here, okay? Nonstop reproductive rights, you know, but it seems to me that this is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I'm sorry. I mean, if you can't, if you have such callous disregard to the process of giving birth and the immediate time frame of a child's life that will determine how they will live to the very end. I mean, I'm looking at John's face here. He's looking at mine. I'm absolutely shocked by everything you say. Okay, shocked by it. Okay, where is the feminism, and where are women standing up and saying we've got this all totally wrong?
You know, I just want to make sure that people understand that what I'm saying here is not just coming out of, off the cuff. I could bring receipts on everything that I'm saying.
No, I'm not doubting you.
No, I just want your listeners to know that because what I'm saying does sound extremely radical, like, oh, he's just blowing smoke, but that's not the case. So
no, I was going to say that was going to be part of my next question. You've clearly got decades of experience, Stuart. I don't know how old you are, but you've about going back to the 1980s when you first did your first residency. I don't have figures, but I know anecdotally our first daughter was born in England and the others in France, that things like home births and other, let's say, more natural forms of childbirth they happen, they take place in Britain. They don't take place in France, where we now live. I believe they take place in Germany. You've got your German things on the wall behind you, and in Scandinavia. With your decades of experience, have you observed any successes in terms of convincing people? Is the tide turning, or are we yet again, facing these these terrible odds? You know, big pharma and habit and all the rest of it.
Okay, I think the tide is turning, and I want to get back in a minute. I want to get back to Peter's question about the feminists, but because I want to, that's that one. I like to talk about that one too. But I think the tide is turning. It's just sort of like watching glaciers melt. It's not fast enough for my liking, for your liking. COVID and the lockdowns. In my country, we had a 30% increase in home birthing, but when it goes from 1% to 1.3%, that's a 30% increase, but it's not the kind of 30% that we'd like to see happen. So yes, but the problem with organizations that have control of things, John, is that they don't let go easily. So when a organization or a system is dying, they tend to become more tyrannical. So I can tell that we're over the target, because they are becoming more tyrannical. They are pushing more legislation to try to restrict midwives, or to bring midwives under the fold of obstetricians. You are seeing more laws passed that say that women can't do this, or women, if a woman wants to have a home birth, she can do it, but if she has anybody skilled there to help her, that's a felony. You're seeing strange things happen in certain countries. Like in Armenia, a home birth is illegal. So no woman can have a person come, and if she accidentally delivers at home, I guess it's okay, but she can't have any skilled person come to her house to help her. when you see them pushing back like that, you know they're in trouble. So eventually, it only changes when it gets bad enough, and when the population realizes that it's bad enough. And I think that with books like RFK's Jr.'s book with Brian Hooker, and even though that they don't get coverage and don't even get they don't get put on the New York Times bestseller list or anything like that, the word is out there that things aren't going well. So I think things are going to change. When I was talking to Jeremy, and I thought the C-section rate in South Africa was 70%, he told me, no, it's on 80%. That's not a change I'm looking for, but eventually the women of South Africa will have to figure it out, and they're going to have to leave the medicalized birth model behind, and some new model will pop up. And it may take the incentive of a billionaire. I wish we had a philanthropic billionaire like Bill Gates who wanted to do the right thing. And help how we come into the world, rather than poisoning us right and left, and all the things, and spraying stuff in the atmosphere that eventually falls onto our food, and all the things that they're doing that gets me off track. But I do think that there's a positive trend to this. I think that there's more publicity. I think the TV show called The Midwives was on PBS, and is a blessing of a show. I think it was very popular. And I think it will take icons. It will take famous people. Having home births does help the system. I mean, they have bodies just like everybody else. They pee and poop like everybody else, but they are famous. So it does help to have famous people who put that story out there. Again, because the corporate media is paid by the big pharma and big medicine and big hospitals and stuff like that, they're not going to be publishing these stories other than the sensational bad story that occurs every now and then from a home delivery. The problem that they don't understand or they don't cover is that newborn intensive care units are filled with babies who came to the hospital inside their mother at term in perfect condition, and somehow through the hospital's interventions ended up in the newborn intensive care unit. You don't hear those stories, but they're legion. Those stories happen all the time.
Have you seen Ricky Lake's documentary, Stuart?
Oh, of course.
So for those who haven't seen it, I recommend it. What's it called again?
Business of Being Born.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. And that's like 11 or 12 years old now, and it's still, nothing has changed. I mean, I look at things that I was doing 40.
I don't.
Sorry, John?
Can you tell us about this documentary, either you, Stuart, or Jem?
Jeremy? Oh, okay. Yeah. Ricky Lake and Abby Epstein. Ricky Lake was a celebrity, and Abby's a producer, filmmaker. And they got together and they talked about the business of being born. And they looked at the models of care and how birth is a business. And there's some great scenes in there. One of the best scenes, I think, is they were talking to 3 residents at one of the local New York hospitals, and they said, so have you seen a physiologic birth, or have you seen a normal birth? And they'll look at each other and they go, no, I haven't. Have you seen one? No, I haven't seen one. Have you? No, we haven't seen one. And I will tell you, through 4 years of training, residents will never see a physiologic birth, because that's not how birth is managed in the hospital. The residents are busy doing stuff, and they're only called to the room when it's time for the nurses to ask them to do something like do a vaginal exam or break the bag of waters or order Pitocin or catch a baby. They never sit for 2 hours and just watch in the corner of a room saying absolutely nothing and just watching a woman labor. And watching a woman labor freely, to move about the room and to eat or drink if she wants to. And to get in the water or get in the shower or get on all fours or get her back or hips squeezed or her back rubbed, or to lift her leg up and lunge because she's trying to help her baby through. No, they're stuck in bed because they have to have these fetal monitors on, which don't do anything, which actually have part of the reason the rise in C-section rate is because of this stage 1 event of fetal monitoring. Stage 1 is something where they bring it into the world thinking that it might do good or it feels good or it's going to make us money, but they never asked the follow-up question was, did it actually do any good? Or if we do this, then what's going to happen? And so they have to wear the belts, they have to stay in bed, They're not allowed to eat just in case they might need an emergency C-section. They don't want them to. All these things are so stupid. They really are stupid, and yet they're routine in pretty much most hospitals. Some hospitals are changing. Again, there's always exceptions to what we're saying. So, but the movie is an excellent documentary, and if you ever want to see an excellent documentary on breech delivery, there's one called "Heads Up: The Disappearing Art of Breech Delivery," and maybe you guys have show notes or something. We can get you that information. I wanted to get back to, if I can, I know I'm interviewing myself here, but I wanted to get back to Peter's question about feminists and where are they? And it's because the feminist movement isn't about family.
Yeah, that's right.
It's not.
That's right.
It's not important. It's about the destruction of the family.
Right.
So childbearing, it should be the most important thing. And if you believe in a bodily autonomy, then women should have the autonomy to give birth how they choose. But they don't really believe in bodily autonomy. It's a false argument. And so, I don't know why they don't fight more for women's rights. And pregnant women, by the way, if they weren't pregnant and weren't exhausted and then have babies on their boobs and all that stuff when they're done, would make a very powerful lobby. Because no politician wants to go against a large mob of pregnant women. It doesn't look good. The optics are pretty bad. So when you get a group of pregnant women on the steps of your parliament, that's going to make the news and somebody's going to do something. But pregnant women tend to be like cats. It's like very hard to herd them because they got life events going on. They're busy. It's not their thing. And the organized medicine counts on that sort of stuff. They count on the fact that they're organized and we're not. They're big and we're small. But even the smallest voice will change the world eventually, and that's what's going to happen. It's going to change. It has to, for the sake of humanity. It has to, because we can't keep getting sicker.
There's an interesting comment that our OBGYN said to us a few weeks ago, Stuart, and he said in about 100 to 200 years, he thinks that women won't be able to have natural births anymore because of the high rate of artificial, well, not artificial, but over-medicalization.
Yeah, do I think that that's true? I think that there's some truth to that. I don't know if it'll happen that quickly. I don't know that biology changes that quickly, but I do believe that one of my mentors is a Frenchman named Michel Audin. And Michel, he's in his 90s now, but he has this theory about the fetuses, the female fetuses in women who have a pre-labor cesarean section are never exposed to their mother's oxytocin. They're never exposed to labor. And possibly that their little uteruses will not develop oxytocin receptors properly. And therefore, when they grow up, they'll have more trouble contracting, and they'll have it. And that's a theory that, again, I don't know that I can prove that, but if you just use your common sensometer, if I'm one of those 500 names in the Boston phone book, it makes sense to me that when you meddle with Mother Nature, there's always going to be downstream consequences, whether or not they're immediate or whether we don't see them for generations. There will be something that's happening. And if you just take a look over the last 100 or 200 years, you can see that when we meddle with Mother Nature, look what we've caused. We've caused superbacteria because we've got antibiotics. We've got, chronic diseases because we're dealing with pesticides and herbicides and things like that. We're changing the way nature designed the planet over eons and eons, and we're with the hubris to not believe that what we're doing is actually going to cause problems. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I just have to look up in the sky pretty much every day, or at least weekly, and I see them spraying this stuff in the ionosphere, or the high up in the atmosphere, wherever it's called, the stratosphere. And it's, it's aluminum iodide, or it's barium iodide, or it's something like that. That stuff falls to Earth. Stuff gets in your food and it's toxic. So why do they think it's not going to cause a problem? Why do they think it's not going to cause a problem to their children? Do they not care about their own children? Do they think they're going to live in a gated community with a bubble over it, like on The Simpsons?
I wanted to ask you, I mean, because we're rapidly running out of time. I mean,
I
we've
know
all
I talk
heard,
too much.
no. There's fascinating discussion, fascinating. But we've all heard about these Silicon titans, you know, people with more money than God. You know, they don't let their children play with iPhones and iPads because they know it's bad for them, for young children. And also very expensive, high quality, healthy food, where they only, well, on the point that you just mentioned there. But I would have to presume, since these people have so many assets and reach, that they're probably listening to people like you, is that, you know, we have to get away from this medicalized, industrialized system, and they're probably using midwives. I wouldn't be surprised at all by that.
Yeah, well, I know some of them, and it's true. I mean, I most of them still go the old-fashioned way, but they have a private physician who you know is probably one of the best in the business and also on call for them. They don't get stuck in the same system. They don't have to wait in lines at airports, and they don't have to wait in lines at emergency rooms. And you know, they have concierge medical systems and doctors, and that you get what you pay for, and they do that. But what's interesting, they can protect their kids all they want, but are their kids going to then only get married and breed with other kids of the same thing, or are they going to go to college and meet some, you know, woman from Oklahoma was eating Monsanto-based Roundup resistant corn, and you know, you can't protect yourself from that. I mean, the idea that we're going to do a gain of function research in a laboratory, like Jeffrey Goldblum says in Jurassic Park, you were so busy wondering if you could that you never bothered to stop and think if you should. Like, what could possibly go wrong? Don't they watch the movies? I mean, when I was a kid, I read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And by today's standards, Frankenstein's a pretty mellow horror book. But by 1960s standards, it was a pretty scary book. And it told you that when man destroys God, man thinks he's God, man creates life, life destroys man. You know, I mean, you just watch it, and it doesn't matter. They just do it anyway. Somebody is going to keep doing these stuffs. Somebody's going to keep messing with this, even if you pass a law like we have in the United States that you can't do it. Oh, we'll just farm it out to Ukraine, or we'll farm it out to China. And why? You know, why are we what's the point? Isn't life good enough as it is? How is this going to make it better?
Yeah.
I don't that part of the brain I do not understand. Those minds I do not understand. They're just, I guess they're unhappy people who want to believe that they'll create something that they can put their name on and live in all posterity. But you know, they might be living in infamy, actually.
It's Faust and Prometheus and Icarus. I'm afraid it's probably as old as humanity. Stuart,
yeah, I'd like to curse them like Sisyphus. Actually, wouldn't that be great? If they could, they could push that rock up, and then oh shoot, now it has to go back up, and over again for all eternity. I mean, some of those people in my country, I could name them, but I won't.
Stuart, we're going to wrap up. Where can we follow you? Where can we find out more? Do you have a blog? You have a Substack? You have a website?
Well, I'll tell you, my biggest baby is our podcast. It's called the Birthing Instincts Podcast, and it's on any podcast app, Spotify, Apple, whatever, iTunes. My website is birthinginstincts.com. And on Instagram, I'm at Birthing Instincts. So everything is Birthing Instincts. I don't tweet. I used to blog and write all the time, and then because of video and stuff like that, I found it much easier to reach a larger audience by podcasting, and doing lectures, stuff like that. And then one of the things that I love doing more than anything is I travel around the world and I teach a 2-day seminar on breech and twin skills. I talk about why medicine is the way it is. I talk about why they talk about breech the way it is, why that they live in fear about that, why they don't know anything about twins. And yet these are, you know, the doctors who are supposed to be experts in these things don't know anything. I just want to, can I give one more example?
Yeah, very quickly, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay. Breech birth is about 4% of term pregnancies. And twins are about 1 in every 33 pregnancies. So about 3 per 100 are twins. And half of all twins will have at least one breech baby in it. So that means about 5 to 6% of all term pregnant women will have a breech baby involved in their pregnancy. Okay, that's about 1 in 16, 1 in 17. Now, if I'm an OBGYN and I'm an expert in all things pregnancy, but I don't know how to do, or I'm scared of breech delivery, that means 1 out of every 17 women that walk into my office, I'm not an expert at. And all I can offer them is a cesarean section. Yeah. So I skew my counseling, and I tell them the benefits of cesarean, and I tell them the false risks of breech or twin vaginal delivery without the benefits of those things. I don't talk about their future pregnancies or anything like that. So how do I deem myself an expert in women's health if I can't take care of 1 out of every 17 women who walk into my office? Yeah. And if I was a resident coming out of training right now and I didn't learn how to take care of 1 out of every 17 women that walk into my office, I would be really angry at my training program. Yeah. And I would go back to them and I would say, you guys fucked me over, if I can say that on your thing. Because now I have to do C-sections, which I find are unethical in these situations because I don't have the skill after 8 years of servitude. And you didn't teach me that. This is a major skill that makes one of the things that makes my profession unique. Without that skill, there's really nothing an obstetrician does that some other specialty couldn't do. So I'm pleading to future people who want to go into obstetrics, make demands on your programs. Ask them before you sign up. Do you teach this skill? If not, why not? Isn't it an important skill to learn? And if they say, well, it's dangerous, you'll say, well, can you show me the data that shows it's dangerous? Because there isn't any. There isn't any data. The data that shows it's dangerous is flawed, is terribly flawed, and it's been proven flawed. And there's so much data out there that says it's safe, or at least safe enough to be offered as an option to a woman so that she can make a decision about which way she wants to go, as opposed to skewing your counseling to funnel them down the path that you, the doctor, or you, the system, wants them to take. This has to stop. It has to stop.
Okay. Very good. Well, Stuart, it's been absolutely fascinating. I'm sure I can see Peter and Jeremy agreeing with me. Wonderful. Thank you so much. You've been very kind with your time, Stuart. We wish you all the best. We encourage our viewers to look you up and to follow your own podcast. Thank you again for your very generous time. Thank you, Stuart. And we look forward to seeing our other viewers at the same time next week. All the best. Goodbye, everyone. Goodbye. Thank you again.